It is lab number 9, y'all. Who's excited? Yeah, we're all excited because we are going to go below the neck today, and we're going to talk about the skeleton. The skeleton is divided into two sections, remember? The cranium and the postcranium. Today, we're going to talk about the postcranial skeleton. Don't forget about your bones of the skull. You might see one or two of those on your quiz today. So brush up on all that stuff. The skeleton below the neck is divided into two sections. The axial skeleton, which contains bones of the midline, and technically that includes the skull, but usually we think of it as the vertebral column, the ribs, things like the sacrum, bones on the midline. But today we're going to talk about something called the appendicular skeleton. You know what your appendages are? They're like your limbs. They hang from the rest of the skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton refers to your appendages. Let's get started. We're only going to do the upper part today. We'll save the stuff below the waist for next class. We're going to start off with your upper arm bone. Now, if you notice the configuration here, your upper arm bone is a single bone, but then you have a pair of bones in your forearm. This big upper arm bone is called your humerus. It's not the funny bone, but it is humerus. Okay, the humerus has a couple of distinctive features, and I'm going to give you a picture of the bone next time, and I'm going to ask you to identify the bone just from looking at pictures. And I may not even give you the whole bone. I might just give you a small portion of the bone. So pay close attention to the distinguishing features. Number one, the proximal end looks different from the distal end. When I say proximal, I mean the one that's closer to the midline. So the proximal end is the bit that plugs into your shoulder. And the distal aspect of the humerus would be your elbow joint. Now we call this round bit a head. It's not a completely round head, but it's close enough. The head of the humerus. Below that is the neck of the humerus. It's not a particularly well-pronounced one, but there it is. And then the shaft of the humerus makes up the majority of it. Now you'll notice this weird stuff going on at the end. It looks like a spool. That's called a condyle. Everybody say condyle. Condyle. You're going to see those all over the place in your arms and legs. Condyles are where two bones articulate, where they touch each other, lock in place, and move off one another. And so condyles are usually very slippery. They're covered with this special type of cartilage called hyaline cartilage. It's kind of like a lubricated version of regular cartilage. But this is the humerus, your upper arm bone. Everybody touch your humerus. There you go. Now, this little thing at the bottom that's just above the condyle looks like it kind of makes it look like a soup spoon, and it's the only bone in your body that has this little divot. And there's a special name for these depressions, these shallow concavities in bones, and the word is fossa. Fossa, a concave pit or depression. So the humerus has a fossa. Don't get this twisted. Don't get it mixed up with the foramen, which you already learned, which is the anatomic word for any type of hole. So the fossa doesn't go through the bone all the way, but it creates this depression. Now you don't need to know what the olecranon fossa is, but I'm just talking about it, and I'm trying to make you aware of the morphology on the bone. And the humerus has this little soup spoon morphology because of that fossa on the distal aspect. Got it? Okay, the humerus. Below that are a pair of bones. The radius, which articulates with your thumb distally. See how if you follow that down, it articulates with your thumb. And the ulna on the other side, it's the bone that articulates to your pinky. Let's talk about the radius first. This picture is way better. Okay, so the radius, you can see it articulates superiorly, proximally with the humerus, and then distally with the wrist bones. This bone is pretty much the same shape and size as its partner, the ulna. I want you to remember, though, that this one, the radius, goes down to your thumb. Now, just memorize one of these two bones. If you memorize that the radius aligns with your thumb, you'll know automatically that it's the ulna that does the pinky business. So take a look at your arm real fast and just palpate. Feel your arm. see if you can feel there are two bones in your forearm. And if you follow your thumb down, that bone is your radius. Now, if I give you this on a quiz, you're going to think that one looks like the other. So pay attention to the differences between the radius and the ulna. Here is your radius. And it has a bunch of bumps, but I'm only going to focus on one that's named after the bone, the radial tuberosity. Radius has a radial tuberosity. And there's a nerve, by the way, that runs parallel to this called the radial nerve. Like, once you know your bones, you've got the first month of med school down. So this is interesting. The radial tuberosity, by the way, just means bump, is a spot where one of your pretty large muscles attaches. Here's your ulna. Notice there's no bump. It's kind of a little bit more curved. It's got a point at the end. It's got this little U-shaped business going on the left side of the bone. It's called the olecranon process. That hooks into that olecranon fossa of the humerus that sits above it. Those two bones kind of fit together. They grab each other at the elbow. But the ulna has that U-shaped stuff on the left, the letter U. The word ulna starts with the letter U. That's how I always remembered it. And I just made this little film from my software today. And you can see the radius and the ulna work together. When you flex your arm, those bones take a ride together. They don't really work independently. That's why some people don't realize there are even two bones in their forearm. The only way you'll know you actually have two bones is when you take your palm, put your palm up, and then twist your bones so that your palm faces down. Facing down, that's called pronation. Face it back up again, that's called supination, like you're holding a bowl of soup. And you'll notice that one of your bones stays put when you rotate. That would be the ulna, the one that locks in. But your radius actually rotates up and over. And so if you play around with that, you'll see the difference. Flexion means you move two bones towards one another. Flexion. So if you want to raise your arm, you want to do some curls, you want to have some soup. The muscle that does this, you've probably heard of, is your biceps. All muscles do, by the way, is shorten. Forget what your Pilates instructor says. There's no such thing as lengthening your muscles. All that muscles do is contract. And so when you want to do your curls, when you want to have a bite of your sandwich, you move that arm up and notice the biceps gets shorter. Now that spot where the biceps muscle is attaching is that bump I showed you, the radial tuberosity. Now when you want to put your arm down again forcefully, like what do you want to do? You want to shove something, gonna say you want to dunk somebody underwater. Okay, let's kill some. Okay, so you want to do the opposite. And now the muscle here, it's actually a three-headed muscle called the triceps, now can shorten, but it has to attach on the opposite side of the bone. So you'll notice the muscle gets shorter and it pulls that up like a lever. So there are two sites where the muscles actually attach. The one on the radius is called the radial tuberosity. The one on the ulna is the olecranon process. And remember, they're on separate bones that run parallel to one another. So they work as a team, yet they have distinguishing characteristics that hopefully you'll be able to note when I give you a test. Which one has the radial tuberosity? The radius. It's named after the bone. And the ulna has that U-shaped process, the olecranon process. Just one more little pick for you guys. When you want to flex your arm, the biceps gets shorter, and that spot where the muscle attaches, that's called the radial tuberosity, a little bump. And it's one of the ways we can tell what somebody did for a living, if they were warriors, if they're hunters, if they're tennis players or whatever, farmers. The bigger the bump is, the more that muscle was recruited in life. And so we look at these muscle scars, these tuberosities and bumps and bulges to figure out ancient patterns of behavior. Cool stuff. Here's that olecranon process, by the way. That is literally the point on your elbow, and that's the insertion spot for the triceps muscle. So here are these very complicated bones that might try and confuse you, but I hope you don't get confused. The ulna has the U at the end. The radius has the bump, the radial tuberosity. And if I point to something on a skeleton, follow the thumb, that's the radius. The pinky, that side is your ulna. Okay, here's the next bone I want to talk about. This is your scapula. I guess we call this the shoulder blade in English, but don't let me catch you calling it that. It is the scapula. It's a flat bone. It's kind of triangular, has a couple of bumps and things and ridges, and it has that one spine that runs across. In humans, by the way, it's a very different bone. It has this morphology where the socket is oriented out to the side. When we meet our early ancestors, they're at a very different angle. This is like a chimpanzee morphology, and this is better suited towards brachiation, climbing, overhead climbing, in fact. So when we find a scapula, we can sort of figure out what somebody was doing with it, whether they were climbing, suspending themselves, or whether they were more like us. So keep that in mind. Here's another bone I want to talk about. It is the clavicle. The clavicle, I guess that's called your collarbone in English. And a lot of people think it's a rib, but it is not a rib. It's part of the appendicular skeleton, and it is the only S-shaped bone that we have in our skeleton. It's shaped like the letter S. You've got one on each side, and this is part of your shoulder joint. Makes up the pectoral girdle along with the scapula. Everybody cool? So if I give you a bone that's shaped like the letter S, there's only one choice. The last thing I want to torture you with or talk about are your carpals. Carpal bones. You have 8 little bones in your wrist. The weird thing about your wrist, it's not really in your wrist, it's in the palm of your hand. If you kind of touch your wrist right now, like wrap your hand around like a wristwatch, you're actually putting your wristwatch around your radius and your ulna. Those 2 bones are where you wear your wristwatch. Those things, it should be called a radio-ulnar timepiece or something, because your actual wrist bones are in the soft, fleshy part of your hand, in your palm. Everybody good? That's it. Quick and easy today. I would suggest, once again, playing Simon Says. Find somebody who can test you. Ask your honey bunny. Ask your husband. Ask your ex-wife. Whatever. Play Simon Says. Point to a bone, and the person has to touch the bone, just like we did with the skull. It is the best way to practice. Okay? So that's it for now, guys. You got a couple of activities as usual, and I'll smell you next time. Okay.